This week on Techno-politics, how much is saving this endangered species worth? Paul Portney of the think tank Resources for the Future and Philip Cooney of the American Petroleum Institute trade off. John Malone, the king of cable TV, has abdicated his throne by selling out to the phone company. Will this man, Brian Roberts, succeed him? And the strange story of the professors and the pork barrel. Mary Jordan of the Washington Post explains.
Techno-politics is produced by the Blackwell Corporation. Major funding for Techno-politics is provided by Pfizer, Inc., a research-intensive healthcare company with global operations. And the Anheuser-Busch companies, committed to the products we make and the world we all share. That's our pledge and our promise. Additional funding for Techno-politics is provided by these organizations.
Welcome to Techno-politics. I'm Tim White. After the Valdez oil spill, Exxon agreed to pay $1 billion for the environmental damage. Now, some said that wasn't enough. Some said it was too much. So now the federal government is rewriting its regulations. And the next time there's an oil spill, the government may be asking you how much to charge.
America's wild places. Even if you haven't been there, you can appreciate their grandeur and their pristine beauty. The enjoyment you may derive from seeing, or even just knowing that these places exist, are called contingent values. And believe it or not, environmental economists are now trying to assign dollar values to these personal aesthetic experiences. If beauty is in the eye of the beholder, how do you put a price tag on it? Economists start by conducting a poll, asking basically, how much would you be willing to pay to preserve such things as the whooping crane, or old-growth forests, or clean air over the Great Smoky Mountains? The economists then tally their numbers and come up with the so-called contingent values. According to one such study, Americans were willing to pay as much as $949 billion to preserve the whooping crane. With only 168 whooping cranes left, that's $5.6 billion per bird. Another study found that Americans would be willing to pay $45 million for each spotted owl. With these astronomical price tags for aesthetic values, an environmental accident in the future could have devastating economic consequences for states, regions, and perhaps the entire nation. It may be time to take a look at the contingent valuation approach before we all get a case of sticker shock.
Joining us now to discuss the concept of contingent values is Philip Cooney of the American Petroleum Institute and Paul Portney of Resources for the Future. Paul, this is a pretty slippery concept when you're first approach it. Maybe you could give us some examples of non-use benefit. What does that really mean?
Well, let me try to give you an example. Suppose there is a unique wilderness area about which you've read, but which you neither intend to go to now or go to in the future, but you nevertheless believe you derive some benefit from the mere knowledge that it exists. That's what's known as an existence value, and that's the nature of the debate that we find ourselves talking about today.
What is the best short argument that you can make as to why there should be a value to me of a wilderness area that I will not visit, haven't visited, don't know about, don't know anybody who's there?
I can't tell you why you should feel that way. What I am confident about is that for any number of people, such values do exist. I derive a benefit from knowing that the Grand Canyon is there, and I would feel that way even if I never intended to visit it, because I've seen pictures of it, and it means something to me to know that there are these unique natural areas in the United States.
Now, Phil Cooney, should that feeling, which we probably all have in one way or another, we're all rather happy to know that the Grand Canyon is there, for instance, if someone wanted to fill it in, should there be a dollar value placed on what we then have lost?
I don't believe so, because I don't believe that these values are capable of being translated into dollars and cents. These are inherently moral and spiritual and ethical values. We have them. People in industry concede that these values do exist. It's like looking at a beautiful sunset. It's like appreciating freedom of speech in our society. When I learned about these things in my 6th grade ethics class, though, I didn't have a monetary meter which accompanied my appreciation of these freedoms. In the same way, we appreciate the knowledge that there's a pristine wilderness in Alaska, there's abundant wildlife, but whether economists, through contingent valuation methodology, which is really public opinion polling, can discern these values and have people express them in monetary terms is a question which we think the verdict is in. It can't be done.
The definition of contingent valuation through public opinion polls is something that would cause a number of people to pause for just a moment, I think, Paul. What is the role of public opinion polls, just stopping people on the street and asking what they think, in determining value?
Well, keep in mind...
Especially dollar value.
Keep in mind that this is not necessarily a public opinion poll. It's conducted, contingent valuation surveys are conducted in much the same way that public opinion polls are conducted, but a typical public opinion poll is, do you favor or are you opposed to this candidate, or do you support this issue or are you opposed to it? The surveys that we're talking about here are attempts to elicit from individuals their willingness to pay to protect a wilderness area, and to try to express that in dollar terms so that we have some idea of the damage that they have experienced if these areas are somehow be spoiled.
In our legal system, if someone is injured due to someone else's negligence, they can collect for pain and suffering, which is a difficult to measure, imprecise quality that nonetheless judges put dollars on all the time.
Sure. Well,
why is this different?
It's distinguishable in that when a jury is given the opportunity to award compensation for pain and suffering, there's no pretense of measurement going on. The judge is saying, you may give him money, but certainly the quality of my legs, I don't want them broken. It's not for sale. I wouldn't sell my legs for $300,000 and say you can go ahead and break them. In the same way, these are moral values. We should be protecting nature, and I think that there are other means other than a liability system which can accomplish this protection. We have the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Clean Air Act, Clean Water, Superfund, oil pollution. These laws in their totality reflect a social desire to protect the environment and to prohibit the incursion of non-use value losses on the general public, the emotional harm that comes as a result of pollution.
So you're not anticipating a $5 payment to you in Arlington and to Phil's family in Bethesda. You're anticipating some sort of anticipatory regulatory block to it happening again. In other words, make it so expensive that under no circumstances will anything like this ever happen again. Is that really what you're after?
Well, and that's exactly the point. The idea is to get some idea of the damages that my household or somebody else's household has felt. There are other damages which those parties heretofore have not had to take into account in deciding how much protection, how many precautions to take, and it sends a signal that there are other damages you haven't had to take into account in the past that you need to pay attention to.
What effect would it have on natural resource users and on energy manufacturers and on the entire industrial base?
On the entire industrial base, I think that the impact would be profound. I think that if this type of liability were taken out of the environmental pollution context where it's been first introduced and applied to airline crashes, ordinary conduct of commerce, it would stop it dead in the water. As I say, UPS could not deliver a package in Washington, D.C. They might hit a tree in Lafayette Park. It might be reported in the local news. There would be terrible regret throughout the metropolitan community about this incident. Maybe they run over some flowers. Should we poll people, ask them what the extent of the regret is that they feel in their hearts for this? Of course, they really can't express it in monetary terms, but you can get enough people to say, well, I guess I'd pay $2 to have prevented that incident. Multiply it by 3 million people, you're talking about a $6 million liability bill for UPS hitting a tree in Lafayette Park. You're not talking about things that are tangible and constructive. You're not talking about reseeding trees, replanting the flower bed, fixing a monument, fixing the sidewalk. You are talking about taking a pound of flesh out of major American companies and minor companies with a deleterious effect on the economy. Mine is an industry that has lost over half a million jobs in the past decade, this is the sort of thing that puts you over the brink.
Is Phil's example overblown or overdrawn?
I think Phil doth protesteth too much here. I think it's a pretty long stretch of the imagination to liken the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Prince William Sound to UPS running over a flower bed at Lafayette Square.
Gentlemen, we go then to our bottom line question. Phil Cooney, first to you. Should polluters pay for contingent values over and above the damage done by the pollution they may have caused?
Absolutely not. Contingent valuation has been an interesting experiment in economics. It has been a total failure. You cannot translate moral and ethical and spiritual values for the environment into dollars and cents.
Paul Portney.
So long as contingent valuation surveys are carefully done and meet very high standards, I believe the results of such surveys can be an interesting starting point for the judicial assessment of lost non-use values.
Thank you both very much.
Up next, merger mania infects the information industry. Will Comcast's Brian Roberts be able to resist? And we'll look at an unlikely place to find government waste, your local community college or university. Mary Jordan of the Washington Post has the story.
Bring more customer choice.
The long-awaited brawl between telephone and cable television companies was put on hold recently when regional phone giant Bell Atlantic announced plans to buy Telecommunications Incorporated, or TCI. That's the nation's largest cable operator. Why did TCI CEO John Malone sell out to Bell Atlantic and accept the #2 job at the phone company? Well, America's newest billionaire may have provided a hint in an interview with Techno-politics in April of this year.
If your question is, could the telephone industry buy the cable industry? Okay, the answer is probably yes. Obviously, the prices would be high. And then the cable industry would be the telephone industry. And I guess some of us might get jobs in that telephone industry and some of us might not. Conversely, the cable industry might buy the telephone industry. You know, mergers of companies, it's always hard to say who bought who.
Wherever Malone goes from here, one thing is certain. By selling out, he has relinquished the title King of Cable. Who will lead the industry now? One strong contender for the throne is this man, Brian Roberts, the 34-year-old president of Comcast Corporation. Roberts heads a company with 2.8 million cable subscribers, the nation's fourth largest. Comcast also has large stakes in program services like CNN and heavy investments in wireless communication. But the jewel in the Comcast crown could prove to be the 12.5% stake in home shopping giant QVC, which under Chairman Barry Diller is bidding aggressively for Paramount Communications, the entertainment conglomerate that includes Paramount Pictures. Diller's competition? Viacom and its chairman, Sumner Redstone, the man who brings you MTV. And, of course, these guys. What does it all mean? If the QVC team succeeds in winning Paramount, Brian Roberts and Comcast may soon own a substantial piece of the data highway and a big slice of the programming that travels on it. Roberts would then have the tools to either take on the phone companies in a battle royal for your telephone and video business, or cut himself one heck of a deal.
Joining us now from PBS member station WHYY in Philadelphia is Brian Roberts, who is president of Comcast, the big cable company. Brian, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Tim. It's good to be here.
You are involved, along with others, Barry Diller, QVC, in trying to buy Paramount. Now, does the bid for Paramount indicate that you think the real value in the communications future is in software, in the programming, the stuff that people watch rather than the wires or the beams that might carry the software?
I think what attracts Comcast to participate in the Paramount chase, if you will, is that we see the cable industry in the U.S. having such a head start on this new technology. For instance, with just adding fiber optics to the backbone, not the entire system, but just to the backbone of our cable system, We think you can easily increase capacity to something like 500 channels. And by putting computers in the middle of that system, it could eventually be an online video-on-demand system. And so then the question becomes, what do you do with that capacity? People don't buy technology. They buy programming, and they buy entertainment, they buy information, they buy news, they buy, software. And frankly, we're delighted to be partners with Barry Diller, who has a history through his very successful entertainment and programming career of creating new products, whether it's Movie of the Week for television networks or whether it's the Fox network itself, an entire network, and many, many other things that Barry's achieved over his career. So if you marry people who want to increase technology with an individual and the ability to put together an organization to create software that people will want and is simple to use and is consumer friendly and really value added, that's what Comcast wants to be invested in both, because we see one without the other not making it. So it's not that we see software being worth more than hardware, rather it's the fact that hardware needs software, and Barry, when he studied all the various technologies coming down, I think was encouraged that this new technology is coming quickly, and there is a real void, and what are people going to do with it? So Comcast wanted to lend as much support as we could and try to hurry this along, because we're ready to deploy fiber optics and bring hundreds of channels of choice or actual video on demand into people's homes in the next 5 years.
Do you think that the effort spearheaded by Barry Diller to take over Paramount will be successful?
I'm not going to comment on any Paramount details at this point. I don't think it would be appropriate.
Brian, you've talked a lot about wiring Comcast systems with fiber optics and so forth so that you could offer phone services and movies and all those futuristic information highway sorts of things. That would cost a lot of money. In order to get the necessary capital, would you have to be lining up with a strategic partner?
I don't believe that that's a necessary step here for any company. If there's an advantage to people to do that, I suspect they'll talk about it. That's why U.S. West and Time Warner got together. But frankly, the capital markets are very efficient. If they see an investment opportunity that's going to make sense for a strategic partner, typically the financial community will offer you their money on very, very similar terms, sometimes better terms. You're only going to align yourself with others if there's real value added. And there's beginning to be lots of discussions about how companies can work together. But it would be really tragic, in my opinion, if the entrepreneurs who founded this great American industry that's unique around the world all sell out to the big phone companies or the big conglomerates. It would be a lot better if there is a mixture of big business and still entrepreneurial and small capital, because it's the mixture, I believe, that gets you the most rapid state-of-the-art thinking, because everybody has a different vantage point from where they're coming from.
Well, does that mean that you won't be selling out to Southwestern Bell?
That's correct. Not just anybody. We're not for sale.
What about some kind of joint arrangement with Southwestern Bell?
We're partners in a cellular business now. We're partners with U.S. West in England, and we're very open to ideas of where you can bring value added. England's a perfect example. We were starting a new business with in trying to build cable, and at the same time trying to build a telephone system. Well, Comcast knew how to build cable, and we needed a partner to help us build telephone. So U.S. West undertook the laboring oar of that, and we helped on the cable side. Now we have about 50-50 revenues. We're well ahead of our projections in both businesses, and it's a terrific success. We did the same thing with Singapore Telephone in Cambridge, England. So we're very open to partnering. We've been partners with Time Warner and telecommunications in the cable business, and partners with big telephone companies in projects both in cellular and cable. So there's a difference between working together and selling out your company.
Well, suppose the Paramount deal doesn't go through, or even if it does, would you be looking elsewhere for programming?
Well, that's one of the exciting areas right now that's growing are the number of companies who would like to get into programming. And our view is Americans want more choice. If you give them 3 choices, they'll certainly watch one of the 3 much of the time. If you give them 100 choices, they'll watch a little bit of 100, but nobody will get 0, because it's just like going to a really fine magazine store. You'll see 1,000 choices, all of which are economically viable. Some very, very narrow niches that have no interest in 95% of the population, but tremendous interest to 5%. And then you have general magazines like Time Magazine and Newsweek that try to reach a broad constituency. And I think that in television, you start with the notion of channels, and eventually you get to the notion of programming.
Brian Roberts, president of Comcast, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll hear from Mary Jordan of the Washington Post, who's found your tax dollars ending up in strange places.
I vitiate the pro forma session.
Ever since there's been a U.S. Congress, there's been pork barrel politics. In the past, the pork has usually been limited to transportation projects like highways and bridges, and sometimes defense projects were porked, so that every congressman's district got a piece of the action. But in the last several years, as budgetary belts have been tightened, Congress has been looking to other sources of funding for the folks back home. One of the latest techniques is called academic earmarking, and it occurs when individual congressmen funnel science projects to researchers in their home districts. In the 1981 federal budget, there were no specific earmarks. But by the 1992 budget, academic earmarks had increased to a total of 499 specific earmarks, worth over $700 million. Well, normally, research and development are funded through a rigorous peer-reviewed process. The idea is to ensure that the most promising research has the highest funding priority. But by earmarking funds for specific institutions or projects, senators and congressmen are picking the winners and losers in the nation's laboratories. Joining us now to talk about the academic pork barrel is Mary Jordan, who's been covering the story for the Washington Post. Mary, there's nothing new about pork or pork stories. What's the wrinkle in this one that makes it worth your attention?
Well, for as long as there's been politicians, they've been trying to shovel money back home for bridges or roads or pet projects. But suddenly they're really angering scientists and scholars because they're going after research money. And there's a finite pool of money that's supposed to advance the scientific research in the United States. And it's a lot of money. It could be $1 billion in any given year. And they're breaking off bits of this, and it's going to universities for kind of somewhat dubious projects like planetariums in some cases in small towns in Michigan.
Of course, the universities can always justify such things, and the universities are involved in trying to get this money, aren't they? I mean, it's not just politicians.
Some, like Harvard and Vanderbilt, have kind of stood up on the platform and say, we think this is wrong because it doesn't go through what they call peer review. There's not an independent team of experts that say, yeah, this is a good use of money. But others, like about 170 other colleges, actually pay as much as $10,000 a month for lobbyists whose sole purpose is to find connections with a congressman to get them this special money.
What's the effect, then, on the peer review process? If there's a limited pot of money that traditionally has been given out through peer review for research facilities and so forth at universities, what's the impact of this favorite congressman ploy?
Well, the impact, sadly, is to reduce the amount of money that the United States has to further research. So, for instance, if we have, let's say, $200 million a year that could go to AIDS research, if it's broken off in little bits of $10 million here for Senator Hatfield's favorite hospital, which has happened, or $8.27 million to go to Traxler's district in Michigan, then what the result is you have less money to do what the country needs.
But of course the politicians and many of the universities would be quick to say that my noble cause is your pork.
And they say it's fabulous, and they say it's the only way little tiny places like Wheeling, West Virginia, which got $41 million because of king of all pork, Senator Byrd, sent $41 million home to a little college that has an operating budget of only $14 million.
So says Mary Jordan of the Post. Thanks for coming in, Mary. And thanks to you for being with us as well. Until next time, for Techno-politics, I'm Tim White.
Techno-politics is produced by the Blackwell Corporation, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for Techno-politics is provided by Pfizer Inc., a research-intensive healthcare company with global operations. And the Anheuser-Busch companies, committed to the products we make and the world we all share. That's our pledge and our promise. Additional funding for Techno-politics is provided by these organizations. For a video cassette of Techno-politics, please call 703-524-2300.
This is PBS.
For a transcript of Techno-politics, please send $5 to Federal News Service, 620 National Press Building, Washington, D.C., 20045. Please specify program topic.